Some lives seem destined to unfold in tragedy. Born at the wrong time, to the wrong family, in the wrong place. This is the story of Gertrude van Fossen, later known as Gertrude Banaszewski. Her life began with rejection, spiraled into loneliness, and ended in infamy. But to understand how she reached that point, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the autumn of 1929. September 22, 1929. Just 1 month into the Great Depression. Her parents, Hugh and Molly van Fossen, were already struggling. Food was scarce, work unstable, and the future uncertain. Gertrude wasn't the first child. She was the third, with 3 more to come after her. Her father shouldered the pressure of providing for 6 children. He found his escape in alcohol. Meanwhile, her mother, Molly, grew distant. And in that distance, something peculiar happened. Though she was warm and affectionate to her other children, Molly withheld that love from Gertrude. She treated her as though she was different, somehow undeserving of affection. This favoritism didn't go unnoticed by the other children, who followed their mother's lead. Gertrude was teased, ignored, made to feel like the outsider in her own home. But there was one person who didn't see her this way, her father. Hugh van Fossen adored Gertrude. She was his favorite. He showered her with the love that Molly refused to give. For a little girl, his affection was a lifeline. It didn't matter that her siblings resented her or that her mother seemed to hate her. Her father's approval was enough. But as we'll see, that fragile happiness was about to be ripped away. Gertrude was only 11 years old when tragedy struck. It was an ordinary evening. She was practicing her reading while her father sat nearby. But suddenly, Hugh gasped for air, clutched his chest, and collapsed to the floor. Imagine being a child and seeing the one person who made you feel loved suddenly fall lifeless before your eyes. Gertrude rushed to him, begging him to wake up. But there was nothing. He was gone. Her cries brought Molly rushing in. She took one look at her husband's body and screamed, not in grief, but in anger. "What did you do?" she accused. "What did you do to him?" Gertrude sobbed, insisting she hadn't done anything. But Molly refused to believe her. The truth was Hugh had died of a heart attack. But in Molly's eyes, Gertrude had killed him. From that night forward, the resentment hardened into something darker. Her father, the only one who ever protected her, was gone. And now, she was truly alone in a hostile household. Gertrude's grief turned into night terrors. Almost every night, she would wake up screaming, reliving the horror of her father's death. But instead of comfort, her mother punished her. Molly saw Gertrude as nothing but a disturbance. While she consoled her other children, she ignored the one who needed her the most. This was the turning point in Gertrude's life. The protector was gone, and in his absence, the cruelty only deepened. As the years went on, Gertrude's life only grew harder. At school, she became a target. Bullied by classmates, ridiculed for being different, and shunned for the rumors spread by her own mother. Molly told people that her daughter was promiscuous, unclean, and not to be trusted. The gossip stuck. And soon, Gertrude was branded with a reputation she couldn't shake. Her siblings joined in. So did the children at school. There was no safe place for her. But something inside Gertrude began to change. Instead of breaking down, she embraced the rumors. If people thought she was promiscuous, then maybe that could work to her advantage. As a teenager, she started seeking affection from boys and young men. She didn't get love from her family or friends, but in the company of men, she found temporary relief. It wasn't real love. It wasn't lasting. But for a girl who had grown up unloved and unwanted, it was something. By 1945, Gertrude was 16 years old. She had dropped out of school. But she wasn't alone. At that age, she met John Banaszewski, an 18-year-old police deputy. For Gertrude, this was her way out. A husband meant security. A husband meant love. And perhaps, for once, a family of her own. But Gertrude didn't let it show. For the first time, she belonged to someone. For the first time, she thought she had escaped the rejection that had haunted her since childhood. But as history often repeats, happiness never lasted long in Gertrude's world. Gertrude Banaszewski's childhood was filled with neglect, trauma, and betrayal. She grew up with rejection, found brief love, and clung desperately to any affection she could get. But as you'll soon discover, the scars of her childhood never truly healed. Instead, they grew darker, more twisted. Until one day, Gertrude Banaszewski would become one of the most infamous figures in true crime history. This was just the beginning. At first, marriage to John Banaszewski seemed like Gertrude's way out. She was just 16, and he was a young police deputy, steady, respected, and promising a future. But behind closed doors, things were far from ideal. The couple would go on to have several children together, but John had a violent temper. Gertrude found herself in a marriage filled with shouting matches, fights, and abuse. For someone who had grown up surrounded by instability, this should have been all too familiar. But Gertrude clung to the relationship, convinced that enduring the hardship was better than being alone. Over the years, John's aggression and Gertrude's own insecurities created a toxic environment. Their arguments turned physical, and Gertrude, once again, found herself trapped in a cycle of neglect and violence. Eventually, John filed for divorce. Gertrude, now a mother, was left to raise their children alone. She had traded one hostile household for another, and she was quickly running out of strength to hold it together. Gertrude remarried briefly, but the relationship was short-lived. By the 1950s, she was a single mother with 7 children of her own. 7 mouths to feed. 7 little lives depending on her. But Gertrude didn't have the money, the stability, or the emotional capacity to provide. Poverty consumed the family. She lived off welfare checks, struggled to keep food on the table, and moved frequently, bouncing from one rental home to another. Neighbors would later recall that her children were often thin, unkempt, and poorly dressed. Gertrude herself appeared worn out, sickly, and exhausted. She smoked constantly and looked far older than her years. Her health declined. Her emotional state crumbled. And in the midst of this chaos, Gertrude began a relationship with a much younger man, 19-year-old Dennis Lee Wright. He fathered her last child, but like the others before him, he eventually abandoned her. By her mid-30s, Gertrude Banaszewski was a single mother of 7, barely surviving, clinging to welfare, and sinking deeper into resentment. And it was during this time that her path would collide with 2 young girls who would change everything. In July of 1965, Lester and Betty Likens, carnival workers struggling to support their family, were looking for someone to watch over their daughters, Sylvia and Jenny, while they traveled for work. Through a network of acquaintances, they were introduced to Gertrude Banaszewski. For just $20 a week, Gertrude agreed to board the 2 sisters in her crowded Indianapolis home. At first, it seemed like a practical arrangement. But soon, things began to unravel. Sylvia Likens was a shy, sweet teenager. Her younger sister Jenny was weaker, suffering from polio that left her with a limp. The girls tried to fit in with Gertrude's household, but tensions rose almost immediately. Gertrude's children spread rumors, accusing Sylvia of lying, stealing, and behaving promiscuously. These accusations ignited something inside Gertrude, a rage that had been simmering for decades. The neglect she had endured as a child, the rejection, the bullying, the betrayal by her family, all of it seemed to resurface. And tragically, Sylvia Likens would become the target of her fury. What began as harsh words and small punishments soon escalated into unthinkable cruelty. Gertrude singled Sylvia out, berating her, accusing her of being promiscuous, just as her own mother had once accused her. The punishments grew more brutal. Sylvia was denied food, beaten with belts and paddles, and forced into humiliating situations in front of the other children. But it didn't stop there. Gertrude encouraged her own children, and even neighborhood kids, to join in the abuse. In her twisted world, the humiliation of Sylvia became a group activity. The parallels are haunting. Just as young Gertrude had once been ostracized, bullied, and labeled promiscuous by her own family, she now turned that same cruelty on Sylvia. But this time, she was no longer the victim. She was the orchestrator. The cycle of trauma had inverted, and what followed was one of the most horrific cases of child abuse in American history. Over the course of 3 months, Sylvia Likens suffered relentless torture at the hands of Gertrude Banaszewski and those she controlled. She was denied food until she was emaciated, beaten daily, burned with cigarettes, forced to endure humiliation so degrading they cannot be fully described. Gertrude seemed to take pleasure in breaking her spirit. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens succumbed to her injuries. She was just 16 years old. When her body was discovered, the full scale of her suffering shocked even seasoned police officers. The story made national headlines. The public was horrified, not only at Gertrude's cruelty, but at how many children and neighbors had taken part in Sylvia's abuse. Gertrude was arrested and charged with murder. At her trial, her own children testified against her. The jury heard details so disturbing that several jurors reportedly cried during testimony. In 1966, Gertrude Banaszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Behind bars, Gertrude attempted to reinvent herself. She was described by some as a model prisoner, even gaining the nickname "Mom" among fellow inmates. But outside the prison walls, she was seen as a monster. The public never forgot the torture of Sylvia Likens. After serving 20 years, Gertrude was controversially paroled in 1985. Protesters gathered, furious that she was being released. She lived quietly in Iowa under an assumed name until 1990, when she died of lung cancer at the age of 61. Her death brought a grim end to one of the darkest stories in American true crime history. The story of Gertrude Banaszewski is more than just the tale of one woman's cruelty. It is a story about cycles of abuse, about how trauma can fester and transform into something monstrous. Gertrude was once a neglected child, rejected by her family, bullied, and accused of sins she did not commit. But instead of breaking that cycle, she perpetuated it. And in doing so, she destroyed an innocent life. The tragedy of Sylvia Likens will never be forgotten. And the name Gertrude Banaszewski will forever be remembered, as a chilling reminder of what can happen when cruelty is allowed to grow unchecked. Please encourage us for our work, like and subscribe.